What's up, Data Transformers? This is Bolaji, and welcome to the Data Careers Show, the show where we watch analytics engineers, data analysts, and data scientists transform their career. We're exploring two data career transformations. One started as an SAT math tutor with a background in applied and pure mathematics, turned robotics lab engineer who uses her powers to build data stacks for cat rescue shelters in her spare time. The other is a self-professed data nerd, passionate about empowering others, who in her spare time races sailboats, uses data analysis to dominate fantasy hockey and fantasy football leagues, and reads science fiction with cats piled on her lap. Please help me welcome Senior Analytics Engineer at DBT Labs, Lauren Benezra, and Senior Data Analyst at DBT Labs, Paige Barrett. Welcome, ladies.
We get to hang out with Paige and Lauren, two of my favorite people in the data world. Lauren, tell us what your job title is and the progression of job titles you had.
So I am currently a lead analytics engineer on the data team at DBT Labs. Before this, I was a resident architect on the professional services team at DBT Labs. So I did a lot of analytics engineering, kind of consulting on our customer side. So I would do what I'm doing now, but for external customers that use DBT. Before that, I was a series of analytics engineers at DBT Labs on the professional services team. And then before that, I was a robotics laboratory engineer. So that was a weird time. I was also a tutor for math and SATs for high schoolers for years.
It's fascinating. So you've been a math tutor, a robotics lab engineer, which I don't know, next to NASA rocket scientist, probably is the coolest job title I've heard. Paige, you've done it all. So tell us what your current job title is and the series of job titles that led up to this point.
Sure. Yeah. I am currently a lead data analyst on the internal data team at DBT Labs. Before that, I was a data analyst at Netlify, and that's a startup that does web stuff. Before that, I was a product data analyst at New Relic, and that was an interesting period because when I first started, I was actually a software engineer on the support org. Turns out I really loved working with the data most, so I went back to being a data analyst at that same company. Before that, I worked at Reed College for a long time in the administrative computing services department doing programmer analyst stuff. A lot of that was some programming mixed with data analysis stuff. But my very first jobs were actually in coffee shops. So I worked in coffee shops for 5 years. And then the transition to tech happened when I got a job at the computer help desk at my college. The rest is history after that.
As well, talk about serendipity. Starting out in coffee shops and ending up where you are currently as a lead data analyst is not the path that most would have predicted. And yet, when I was at Coalesce a few months ago, almost everyone that I met did not start out studying data science in college. For example, why do you ladies think that is?
Data's a really interesting world. Almost everyone I know also didn't come from a data world. It's a field that is very cool because it's a low bar to entry. If you learn a bit of SQL, which is a very friendly programming language, it's not like Python that the libraries are so massive that it is really, really hard to become proficient in. But SQL is something that it's not terrible to learn SQL. I read a book and I was like, oh, I know SQL now. Great. Okay, cool. Yeah, Python's not like that. C++ is not like that. It's a much trickier hill to climb. And then you can grow very quickly. It's also a field where you don't necessarily need that fancy degree. And honestly, up until 10 years ago, degrees in data analytics didn't even exist. So everyone from my generation and before had to study something else. There was no way to just study data analytics.
Yeah, same for me.
That's interesting. Paige, you mentioned being a data nerd. I was a comic book nerd growing up, okay? And so I very much got into origin stories. And I'm curious as to how, for yourself, Paige, and then for you, Lauren, what those first sparks were that actually inspired you to start to chase down this lifelong love of data. When did you, was it in kindergarten? When did you first discover your love for data?
I've always been interested in math and numbers. Even when I worked at the coffee shop, there was a time where I was working in the office doing office tasks for the coffee shop. And I would just get so into using, I think it was Excel, to figure out all of the finances for the company and what we were getting in and putting out. And were there different days where we were busier and when and why that might be. It's just a level of curiosity that's always been there that having numbers and data has always seemed like a route to satisfy that curiosity for me.
I was a big math person. So I did my undergrad in math, theoretical math. And then I did.
It's a thing.
Yes, it's a terrible idea. No one should do it. Do not recommend. But yeah, and I did my grad school in applied math. And that is probably where I started thinking about data because I was applying all of these principles to all kinds of things. I did a paper on cat population dynamics and how that exists. And then I did my final dissertation on bacterial stem cells and how they grow and all of that. So it was a really cool thing to be able to suddenly think about how math can translate into a whole bunch of pieces of data. And then I started to work at a biotech company and was designing experiments and stuff for the team there. And that was a really cool way to start to see the results of all of these pieces come together. In a really applied field. And I think that's probably where my data brain started tingling.
Wow. It's interesting, Lauren. A lot of times you talk to young people still in school and they lament a lot of stuff about school, mostly about how am I ever going to use this stuff in real life? But specifically on math, a lot of times kids will complain, like, how does this apply to real life? And so having a SAT tutor specialist sitting with us here, how did you engage in those sorts of conversations about math doesn't apply in real life?
Yeah, to kids. Oh my gosh. I spent a lot of years. I was a tutor for 9 years after I graduated from college before I went to grad school. And I was like, this is applicable. Why is it applicable? Well, from a theoretical point of view, not a lot. It's not super applicable. But when you start to get into the applied world, it is everywhere. And I'm constantly teaching my husband, like, how can we calculate does this litter box fit in this closet? Let's look at angles and let's calculate a little thing. We built this wall in our house and he was like, I need to figure out where to place these slats. And so I made a little equation for us and we can build that stuff. It's everywhere. It is so helpful to be able to take those skills that you learn in school and create a nice little equation and plug and play some different things. I think any adult with like a little bit of Excel skills will tell you that when they make themselves a little Google sheet of their finances or their, for their vacation or whatever, like anything at all.
Yes.
It's really helpful to know a little bit of math.
It's how I do well at fantasy football and fantasy hockey.
Yeah. It's everywhere. Yeah. It's so helpful.
This is exciting. I'm reading some science fiction right now. The author's name might be Blake Crouch, but he writes about all this near future scenarios where there's gene editing and there's technology, there's AI and all this sorts of stuff. And I see math being applied in a lot of these fields, actually, a lot of these fields. So yes, stay in school, kids. Sorry, so hard. Math definitely pays off. But I want to dig in to this segment that we're calling data disasters. Okay. If you're a data professional, you've been there. You've had some doozies. Do you recall any particular scenarios anywhere in your career where you found yourself in a data disaster that you did not think you were going to survive?
Yes. One of my earlier jobs, I learned about the importance of having good backups for the data in your database. I was doing a project cleaning up the addresses for our constituents in a database. And there was a point where I thought my SQL command was going to do one thing. And it's something very unexpected to the point where we lost all of the zip codes. On.
And the backups.
The backups definitely weren't there. It took most of the day to get them working and get the data back. But that was an excellent lesson in how important it is to make sure you've got backups for your data.
And if I may add, these automated backups. I remember back in the day, 'cause I had built this social network. This was like in 2000 or so. So it was still a really new concept. We used my SQL and everything was going swimmingly. I think we had the automated backups at a frequency of once per week. And I accidentally, when trying to do some cleanup, deleted the entire database. So of course I went to the backups, but they were a week old. And so everything that had happened in the past 7 days, which was a lot, we lost forever.
And there's such tough lessons. Those are definitely tough, but you never forget. I definitely also learned to run any sort of SQL command that's going to change data on a very small population.
That's smart.
Yeah.
That's why they pay you the big bucks, Paige.
That's right.
Not me. Lauren, tell us about a data disaster that you still remember today.
I don't know that I have a data disaster that is like a disaster. I haven't broken anything. The beauty of working in the transformation layer is that I'm not touching raw data. I'm not doing a lot of like, let me change raw data. So there's, if I have Snowflake and I have some nice Snowflake history, like I can just pop back into whatever I did 4 hours ago to ruin something and just get it back, which is pretty delightful.
Can we have that in real life? I've made some choices in my...
Yeah, I mean, that would be great, but...
Lauren, if I could flip that question a little bit and maybe we think about hard technical problems, because I love how you've answered that really. I'm a systems thinker. And so I make mistakes, but then rather than just trying to fix the point problem, I try to fix it systematically. You've uncovered something where it's like, okay, if you're working in a transformation layer, it actually shields you from yourself. But what have been maybe some technical issues that you've actually run into and you've had trouble working through?
I think there's pieces of the data stack that I don't know super well. So there's that where like I'll run into an issue where I really need to have another skill. And so I need to spend time learning that skill before I can sufficiently complete said task. But I think that's true with anything, like I dealt with that in robotics also. Like there's the skills that you have to build up. And you make little mistakes along the way because you're just trying to figure it out. Hopefully you don't ruin someone's experiment. Like I did that several times with robotics. And the beauty of data to me, like being in this industry, I'm not scared to push changes. I'm not scared to add something to the database and break something because I can go back. It's so great. There's a safety catch for everything. You can revert a change. You can go back using history. It's pretty good.
I love that, Lauren. And you talked about sometimes running into scenarios where you might not have the necessary skill set to solve a piece of the problem. It makes me think about this idea of collaboration. I'd love, Paige, if you could unpack some situations in which you found it necessary to not necessarily master all the skills yourself. How do you figure when it's time to reach across the data aisle?
Yeah, I feel like this is such a fun topic because there are so many cool ways that we are able to collaborate when it comes to figuring out when we need to, from a perspective of me working on something, a data analysis or dashboard building kind of thing. That will often happen when I can get to a point where, say in a BI tool, I've created this complicated SQL statement and it's got lots of CTEs and it's doing a lot of cool stuff and it's making this really awesome chart that is getting to what I'm trying to get to for the data. Then there's a point of saying, well, this is really important logic. I don't think this should live in the BI tool. This should actually live in our project. That's the point where often my skill set runs into limitations, where that's where I need to connect with Lauren and her expertise on like, how do I take this like massive SQL statement and actually turn it into something that is like functional in terms of being models in the like intermediate layer perhaps, or or into these like building blocks of business data that make sense to be separated out and actually are going to be performant when they're part of our DBT project. Because in the BI tool, sure, it can take a minute to run. That's fine, or maybe more than that. But when we're actually going to be running something as part of our project and it has to run pretty often during the day, that time adds up. And I need help often figuring out like what's going to be a more performant way to get this logic into our project.
I love that. One of the challenges with collaboration, I know this very well because at times I'm super guilty of finding interesting problems and just wanting to go into my rabbit hole and not be bothered, keep out to the sign of my door. Lord, I imagine that there's sometimes conflict between roles on a data team.
I think a lot of it is in communication and trying to understand, number one, what are the expectations that we all have across all the teams? Sometimes there's confusion because people have not been told where the boundaries of their role lives and when they should ask questions across the aisle. Right. Sometimes it's really just a matter of let's sit down and talk about this. And if the expectation is like, why are you adding something to our DBT project? Awesome. If you want to learn something, sweet. Let me please help you. And we can figure out how to do this together and I can support you. I don't have a conflict in that I don't want someone to do my job. It's mostly that I want to make sure that someone is being supported in the way that they should and also contributing good things to our DBT project. So it's really more just let's communicate, figure out what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, and then move on from there. So I think conflict is a strong word.
I'm fascinated though, because you've got data engineers, data analysts, even a scientist, then you have analytics engineers. I'd be curious as to how each of you might categorize yourselves and whether you see sort of sometimes overlap between those job titles.
Yeah, it's definitely some overlap. Yeah. I think the job titles in the data space is always a really interesting topic because there are kind of a lot and it isn't very clear necessarily what everyone means by titles. We're all still kind of working out those definitions in a lot of cases. But from my experience around I know less about data engineering. I will admit I've probably done some, but not well. So I'm less familiar maybe with where the data engineering and analytics engineering overlap. But I do have more experience around where analytics engineering and data analysis overlap just because I've done a lot of both in my career. I think when you're working as like a data analyst, the piece where you go further and is separate from analytics engineering is the part where you're actually like taking and interpreting results from looking at data in different ways. Like that's where you get into the point where you're actually telling stories with data or answering specific questions with the data. Like that's where the jobs are different.
Honestly, it almost reminds me of the story of the 12 blind people all feeling an elephant and trying to describe it, and they all describe it very differently. I think that's real. So you've given us one perspective for sure. And I appreciate the fact that you don't necessarily have a Webster's dictionary exact definition. Lauren, from your end, how would you view the bleed over between analytics engineer and data engineer? How do you rationalize that in your mind?
Yeah. So analytics engineer, that title didn't really exist before DBT because there wasn't a principle for how people develop this kind of work. So this transformation layer,
right.
What it used to be is that it was essentially a bunch of people saving SQL files in to answer specific questions and doing kind of what we are doing as this transformation layer, but all in one query to get this answer for this one person. And when someone needed to recreate some of those joins or some of that code, they would go and find that file maybe and copy parts of it and put it into another file and run that by itself and then send it off to that other person that needed that answer. So once DBT came along, analytics engineering became something kind of parallel to software engineering, where our job is to sit in between the analyst and the data engineer and basically take care of this baby that is our transformation layer. And so we live in Git repos, right? And we are essentially protecting the design and the growth of this project Dave Connors, of course, is the first person to talk about DBT as a small baby, but essentially it's going to grow up into an adult, hopefully, and hopefully a very well functioning adult that performs efficiently and still has to grow and learn some things, but does actually follow some patterns and learns along the way. That's where I live. I'm spending 90% of my time in DBT and in Snowflake in that transformation space. I'm trying to build something that is clean, that is reusable so that it is efficient and be able to provide pretty clean, almost to the right answer data sets to the analysts so that they can then take that final, almost at the right answer, tweak it, transform it, and tell that final story to the stakeholder. I don't do a ton of let me talk to the stakeholder and let me make you this like beautiful interpretation of all of this data. I am actually not good at that. It is not my skill set. I don't want to do it. I find it so difficult. Like I can't do it. I don't know. I can't do it. But I don't need to because Paige is here and I can just be like, Paige, I built you this like pipeline and now like here's almost the right set. Can you tell the story with this? And then she'll take it and make this beautiful story. And the data engineer is really like, can you, oh gosh, now the metaphor has gotten really like weird. So I'm going to stop with the metaphor. Like I need the beginning stages of the data. Okay. Like bring me the raw data. Like that is where the data engineer kind of lives and like building those pipelines in order to get me that teeny tiny baby that I then need to transform. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Pipelines and babies, and let's figure when I need therapy at some point. I can tell you, So I had the opportunity to attend a DBT meetup yesterday. Just last night was my very first one in Raleigh, North Carolina. And by the way, last night we had 3 DBT meetups on the same night for the very first time. There was one in Paris. Amara Echeverria runs our meetups. She was there. We had one in Austin. And then we have, hey, Jenna Jordan in the house. Jenna was at the Raleigh meetup yesterday. We have one in Raleigh as well. I spoke to this one young man named Daniel, and he's worked in biopharmaceuticals for a while, but he's trying to transition into a data role in that industry. And he was asking me what sorts of skills I think he ought to build. So, of course, my skill is handing him off to the nearest expert because, Daniel, I don't know. I just got the shirt with the logo on it. I think it looks pretty. So I found someone in pharmaceuticals who was a data professional, and they had a great conversation. I'm not privy to what they discussed, but I'd be curious, particularly because both of you ladies have slightly different perspectives. If a young professional comes up and says, I'm learning SQL, I'm learning Python, what else do I need in order to make it in this data world? How would you advise them?
Yeah, if they're interested in the data analysis side, which is the part I'm most familiar with from recent experience, then I would say practice thinking about questions that you are curious about things in the world that you can find data sets about, and practice answering questions with that data. Like think about a question, think about how you would try to format that data into a way that could give you an answer or help you in a direction towards maybe more questions. And also practice like how you would want to show that to someone. I mean, some of the first things I do when I'm thinking about how I want to answer a question with data or tell a story is I'll actually just draw out a chart and be like, if I have the data in this shape and it's saying like, A or B, what do I want the chart to kind of look like to help me get an idea of what the shape of that data needs to be behind it in order to produce something like that. Those are the kinds of things I think, like practicing that, thinking about that. There are a lot of actually public data sets out there, and there are ways to get like a free account on a database, or maybe just like Google Sheets and download data into there and just play with it. And that's a really cool way to just like be curious and play and try things. Because that will help like really nurture the passion. And it's like that passion and curiosity and ability to communicate, to ask questions and communicate a story that make you build your skills for data analysis.
Lauren, I'm guessing you don't start out by visualizing what you want the chart to look like.
I mean, not the chart. No, definitely not the chart. I try to stay away from charts. What I find to be really helpful if you want to get into analytics engineering specifically is like taking something that is a really horrific SQL query on, like Paige said, public data sets and building it out with these software engineering practices that DBT has put forward. Rebuilding like something that is messy and awful and terrible into something that is reusable into different pieces, something that is performant and can run very quickly, something that, applies a lot of different principles like do not repeat yourself, something that uses some fun macros, and just practice that stuff. And you can always download DBT Core, of course. You can open a DBT Cloud developer account that's free and connect it to a free BigQuery. BigQuery has a free version where it's basically under a certain number of gigs. And you can just use that as your storage space and then use DBT Core or Cloud as your transformation and just practice, do something super fun. Yeah, use DuckDB. There's a ton of like projects that are available on the internet. Go searching and find someone's questions, find someone's project and start looking through what they've been doing and practice. Because the biggest thing really in this space is to demonstrate that you understand those concepts. And the easiest way to show someone that you do is to have a public Git repo.
Well, to your point, Lauren, a handful of folks who reached out to me in the community, in this case, active data professionals, and they might be searching for their next position or looking to pivot just a little bit. They're seeking advice, but what you're sharing, essentially, if people want to demonstrate their expertise, much more so than a LinkedIn profile or even a resume, like show your work, go do something cool on the side. And then you could call in people to mentor you, or you could show that to a prospective employer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love that. With that being said, I want to shift into a segment of the conversation here, about a topic that's not so comfortable for a lot of us to talk about, which is imposter syndrome. For some reason, it's not a topic that professionals like to talk about very often. Let's just name the elephant in the room. We all love to show up our highlights on LinkedIn and all these other public spaces. But imposter syndrome is something that many of us struggle with in a very quiet and private fashion. I wonder if you're able to maybe share if this is something you've dealt with personally and how you've managed to combat it.
Yeah, I totally suffer from imposter syndrome so much. And I did a whole talk about it with Paige last year at Coalesce, specifically because people don't talk about it. And I think the biggest way to feed your imposter syndrome is to sit alone in a room and only have thoughts about your imposter syndrome. The best way to combat it is to talk about it with all the other humans in this space that have imposter syndrome, which is basically everybody. And if you start realizing like, oh, everyone is doing this and everyone feels like, oh, I'm not good enough and I don't have the right skills and I don't have the right GitHub and all of this stuff, then you start to realize that it's just common in our space. There's so many skills here. There's so many different little tiny things to learn. There's so many places that there's a lot of egos too. And so you're kind of dealing with this world where if you don't have the ego, then it's really easy to start kind of beating yourself up about your own skills and all of that. So I think the easiest thing to combat it is to talk about it with other people and to realize that most people probably have it and are feeling in similar positions.
Yeah, I totally agree.
It reminds me, I heard something recently where someone said you should never compare your beginning to someone else's middle. It's so easy to look at other people's public profiles and see what amazing things they're doing and feel honestly discouraged about it. Sometimes that inner voice might tell us to not even bother trying. How are we ever going to catch up to a Paige or to a Lauren? Paige, what's been your experience with this whole imposter syndrome thing?
I definitely have experienced it for my entire career in data, which is now more than 20 years. So it's still here. A lot of the things that have helped me tend to be around even what you're talking about with that comparison. It's hard. I feel the imposter syndrome more when I do compare myself to other people. I'm able to tamp it down when I compare my current work to like what I was doing 6 months ago or a year ago or 5 years ago. That has been like helpful for me. And also I've learned to get good at documenting for myself when I do something I'm proud of, so that for those days when I'm feeling like I don't know how to do this job, I can go back and look at just a few minutes of looking through some of those like screenshots or, write-ups or things like that. It really turns that like spiral around. And it's like, no, this, how I'm feeling today may be a phase, but it's just right now. This is actually the reality. I do know what I'm doing. I can do a good job. Those things have helped a lot. And then I think another thing that has been really amazing is finding opportunities to mentor. It is actually also like incredible because that's a lot of I don't know, it's really fun to see other people like learn and grow. And something about that tends to just sort of take all of the sting out of any kind of imposter syndrome, because it feels like we're all learning and growing. Like, this is really actually cool. So
I love those couple of techniques that you shared, Paige. The one regarding documenting for yourself. I've been guilty of this. I'll be in the middle of a job or role, I'm kicking butt, I'm taking names, the accolades are pouring in, and I almost just sort of accept it as, this is status quo. It's always going to be like this. And I don't document anything. And then I get into the low. I get into the valley, and I'm like, where are my accolades? Does anyone see me? I love that idea of documenting. I think that's really smart. It's a great habit to build, probably. So thank you for sharing that. This is really interesting. Maybe we flip that question a little bit. Now we're not talking about the internal dialogue, having confidence in ourselves and where we fit into this data world. If we look outwardly toward the data, this idea of data confidence. I'm new to the space, but even as an outsider, as a marketer, I was a marketer for 15 years in demand gen. And a lot of times I'd have data questions, interesting data questions. But by the time I went into the systems and pulled out did the queries and pulled out the answers, I didn't have confidence in the data. How do you all deal with this battle of lack of trust in the data that you're actually working with? Lauren, I'd love your thoughts on it.
It's very tricky, right? Because if you've already given away some dirty data, some bad data, then your stakeholders are going to be like, well, I don't trust it. But I think the beauty of something like DBT, and I'm again, like, I realize this sounds biased, but this is the world that I live in I live in DBT. That's most of my job. So how do I deal with it is creating these clean data sets, having testing, making sure that like everything, all of the logic, like using unit testing, all of that stuff is making sense, and testing all the way along the transformation layer and into the raw data. So to me, the data transformation layer with proper testing, with proper like technique, making sure that you have clean data sets, all of that is really the best way to build trust.
Well, this is one of my favorite things, because this is knowledge that has been hard won after lots of painful experiences. Something that I've developed is this system for identifying all of the places that my logic could be wrong, or it could be introducing a bug without realizing it. It tends to have to do with like sort of sets of queries that I'll run to early on when I'm working with a data set to make sure I really understand what's in there. Like, are there nulls where I don't expect them to be? Or what's even like the total count that I want to get to? So that if I write like the whole SQL query and I come up with an answer and I don't have some of that preparation done to make sure that I know like what reality is, then I'm not going to be able to compare like my answer with what reality is, or tweak it and then compare, tweak it and then compare and make sure. So I have to have that set of like processes first. It almost like becomes this this instinct that if you do it enough, it starts to be like, wait, this is too easy. Wait, this is too clear. It's like I want to come in as a skeptic of my own work and say,
Wow.
but did I check this, just to make sure? So, and that has come from years of working with stakeholders who ask those questions. So now I know what the questions are, and I make sure to ask them myself of the data first. That's a lot of what I do. And I think because I have this process and this experience, I've been able to develop a lot of data confidence. But yeah, there can be pitfalls for sure, especially if you have delivered something incorrect at one time. It does take a lot of work to rebuild that trust.
Yeah, we're going to turn skeptical Paige into an animated GIF or something. I'd love to ask how you measure the impact of your work on the business. But before we get to that one, I want to jump into a really fun one, which is exploring the story of a project that you are particularly proud of. What's the story of a project that gives you all the good feels and that makes you really proud?
This is probably sound pretty funny, but two of the projects that I felt the most proud about were the projects that I did for technical assessments for my last two jobs that I got.
Wow.
I mean, it's one of those really cool things where it's like I had to build something completely from scratch, all the way from getting raw data, transforming it, building dashboards with it, recording a walkthrough of what the data story was. It's one of those, both of those are things I'm just incredibly proud of. These are things that I do go back and sometimes watch at a low point of like, no, I do know how to do this. I know how to do this. So those, I'm very proud of those.
I love that. I love that. Lauren, what about yourself?
There's a project that's not a data project. That was actually one of my favorite things. Built a hacky little solution to print a whole bunch of teeny tiny labels. This is so silly and so like specific to biotech, but it was life-changing for these scientists because they had to print these teeny tiny, like hundreds of these teeny tiny labels on these teeny tiny vials, and they would otherwise have to like handwrite every single one. And so I created this little hacky Python script that would allow them to just like talk to a printer and just print these tiny labels. I think it's the stuff like that that's like you really change a person's life with an automated solution. Like that is really, really exciting because you can see the impact. You can see that like their time has been freed up and they are so stoked. And I think those are maybe the most fun. But a data specific thing, I did build a cat stack for this cat rescue that I volunteer for, and basically built it from like end to end. Did a coalesce talk on it. You can look that up. It was 2 years ago. But yeah, so that was super fun. And like the data is so fun to be able to see how we're impacting the cat world and cat populations in Oakland.
Wow. Yeah. I read that on your LinkedIn page. You fostered cats for several years. Paige, folks are asking, so we want to know, tell us a little bit more about some of the volunteer work that you're doing related to the data work.
Yeah, I think so before the pandemic, but there were a couple of organizations I was doing data work for. One of them was called Hack Oregon. We were doing a bunch of analyses around like people experiencing homelessness and home prices in Portland and how they were changing. And then another one, for a while I worked with Chick Tech, which is an organization that supports women in tech, and doing a lot of analyses around our marketing and endeavors and trying to figure out like what avenues were working better for getting sponsorships and things like that.
Right. I love that. I have two more questions I'm dying to ask. First question. Key mentors or influences. Is there someone or a group of people who have influenced you somewhere along your journey? If so, how did they influence you?
I had a boss at my last biotech job who I was doing laboratory robotics, and he basically handed me a book on SQL and was like, learn this. We need to build a database.
That's how the movie started.
Yeah. His name was Esteban Toro. He's still a very delightful human being. He still works in biotech. And yeah, he basically introduced me to SQL. He introduced me to the data world. He introduced me to DBT, gave me a title of analytics engineer, and like totally changed my career because I would have probably, I don't know what I would have been doing. Maybe laboratory robotics, maybe like stayed in the biotech world, maybe just done software engineering stuff. But yeah, he like totally changed my life. He knows.
Life you lost.
Yeah, I love it so much. I had a actually really similar mentor, former manager who kind of did the same thing, essentially handed me a book on database administration for Oracle databases and then another one on learning Java. And those were life-changing as well. This changed my life. Yeah, the experience, like the fact that he believed in me and gave me those opportunities. I also had really learned a lot from Emily Cherio. She was a manager of mine at Netlify. And yeah, she taught me a lot about how to grow people around you that I'll never forget.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get her on the show as well. So I'm really excited to hear her name. Thank you both for sharing those. You both just completely glowed while you were talking about those stories. I think it's so valuable for us to remember those who helped us get to where we are. Maybe that will also empower us to be that person for someone else. Final question. This has been so much fun. Thank you. Final question. Where do you see yourself career-wise in 5 years? We saved the toughest for last.
What I see myself doing is continuing to mentor data analysts. In terms of like what I'm doing for a job, that is less clear. It's more just like I know that I will be helping people grow in this career. That's like the thing that it is like a passionate through line of everything I do.
That's a good one. Where am I going to be in 5 years? I don't know. Hopefully working 4 days a week. That would be my goal. Is to, that would be ideal. I'm trying to figure out how I do that. Maybe I'll be a real estate mogul. You don't know. There's options.
Thank you. You both are really amazing. You inspire a lot of us with your transparency, your excellence. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much. This was really fun to do.
I had the most fun of all. Bye for now.
Bye.
This show is brought to you by DBT. DBT is the industry standard for data transformation. It allows your team to prepare data for analysis in a way that's centralized, modular, and entirely open, all inside your cloud data platform. The outcome? Consistently dependable analytics for your organization. Now, the DBT community was built for and by data pros. Come hang out and transform with 70,000 of the brightest analytics engineers, data analysts, and data scientists in the world. With DBT, you transform your data. With the DBT community, you transform your data career.